On the morning of February 24, 1966, while Kwame Nkrumah was on the plane returning from Vietnam, a group of army officers and police officials, backed by Western intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, launched a coup d'etat called Operation Cold Chop. The coup was led by General Joseph Ankara, Colonel Emmanuel Kotoka, and other discontented military officers who accused Nkrumah of corruption, authoritarianism, and mismanaging Ghana's economy. Soldiers stormed key government buildings in Accra, seized the national radio station, and announced that Nkrumah had been overthrown. On the streets, celebrations broke out among sections of the population who had grown frustrated with shortages, rising prices, and Nkrumah's increasingly autocratic style. His secret police, political repression, and ambitious but costly projects had alienated many. Statues of Nkrumah were toppled as soldiers and civilians marked the end of his rule. For Nkrumah, the news was devastating. Stranded in Beijing after his Hanoi mission, where he had brokered peace during the Vietnam War, he was informed by Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai that he could not return home. Exiled in Guinea, he lived under the protection of President Ahmed Sékou Touré, who named him honorary co-president. The events of that day not only ended Nkrumah's presidency, but also crushed his dream of turning Ghana into the spearhead of African unity and socialism, leaving a legacy of both monumental achievement and bitter downfall. All these would have been avoided if only Nkrumah hadn't made this one mistake. A mistake that led to the end of his rule as president of Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah, one of Africa's most influential and charismatic leaders, was born on September 21, 1909, in the small town of Nkroful in the Gold Coast, a British colony that would later become Ghana. His early life was modest, raised by his mother, Nyaniba, in a matrilineal Akan family. Although little is recorded about his father, Nkrumah grew up with strong influences from both his mother and the village's Catholic missionaries. Education became his gateway out of rural life. He excelled in school, attending the Akimota School in Accra, where he was introduced to modern ideas and the possibility of leadership. In 1935, driven by ambition, he traveled to the United States to further his education, a move that would shape his worldview. In the United States, Nkrumah studied at Lincoln University and later at the University of Pennsylvania, immersing himself not only in academics, but also in the intellectual and political ferment of the African diaspora. He encountered the writings of Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and other Pan-African thinkers who championed black unity and independence. During his years in America, he worked various odd jobs to support himself, but he also honed his oratory and political organizing skills, becoming active in student movements. Later, he moved to Britain, where he studied at the London School of Economics and became deeply involved in Pan-African politics, helping organize the historic 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945, which gathered leaders and intellectuals who would later spearhead Africa's independence movements. Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast in 1947 at the invitation of the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, a nationalist political party seeking reforms from British rule. Initially brought in as General Secretary, his radical approach soon clashed with the UGCC's conservative leadership. While they preferred gradual reforms, Nkrumah wanted immediate self-governance. His slogan, "Self-government now," electrified the masses, particularly the youth, workers, and rural farmers. After riots in 1948 that followed protests against colonial economic policies, Nkrumah and other leaders were arrested, but his popularity only grew. By 1949, he broke away from the UGCC to form the Convention People's Party, CPP, a mass-based party that relied on grassroots mobilization, rallies, and the press to galvanize ordinary Ghanaians. The CPP quickly became a formidable political force. In 1950, Nkrumah called for a campaign of positive action, strikes, boycotts, and civil disobedience aimed at forcing the British to concede independence. He was arrested and imprisoned for subversive activities, but this only amplified his popularity. When elections were held in 1951, the CPP won a sweeping victory, and Nkrumah, still in prison, was released to become the leader of government business in the colony's legislative assembly. His rise from prisoner to leader symbolized the aspirations of the people. Over the next few years, constitutional reforms expanded African participation in governance, and in 1952, Nkrumah was named Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. His relentless push for independence paid off when, on March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast achieved sovereignty and was renamed Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence from European rule. The independence celebrations in Accra were historic, drawing dignitaries and leaders from across the world, and Nkrumah's proclamation, "At long last, the battle has ended, and Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever," resonated far beyond Ghana's borders. For millions of Africans, Nkrumah was a symbol of liberation and possibility, the man who had broken the colonial chain. In 1960, Ghana became a republic, and Nkrumah was elected its first president. His tenure was characterized by grand ambitions to transform Ghana into a modern, industrialized nation and to spearhead African unity. Domestically, he launched massive infrastructure projects, building roads, schools, hospitals, and the ambitious Akosombo Dam, which provided hydroelectric power and symbolized his vision of industrial progress. He expanded access to education, making it free and compulsory at the primary level, and invested heavily in higher learning, establishing the University of Ghana and other institutions to cultivate an educated elite. Nkrumah's foreign policy was equally bold. He became the continent's most vocal advocate for Pan-Africanism, believing that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless the whole of Africa was free. He provided support to liberation movements across the continent, hosted conferences in Accra, and worked tirelessly to build regional alliances. His efforts culminated in his key role in the founding of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, which he hoped would evolve into a continental government. Yet, his presidency was not without problems. His economic policies, while visionary, often strained Ghana's finances. The focus on rapid industrialization led to heavy borrowing and reliance on cocoa exports, which were vulnerable to fluctuations in global prices. When cocoa prices fell in the early 1960s, Ghana's economy suffered, creating shortages and inflation. To maintain control, Nkrumah increasingly resorted to authoritarian measures. In 1964, Ghana was declared a one-party state under the CPP, and dissent was suppressed. His government relied on preventive detention laws to silence critics, and a personality cult grew around him, with titles like Osagyefo, Redeemer. But the big question is, what exactly did Nkrumah do that led to his downfall? Kwame Nkrumah, the charismatic leader who delivered independence to Ghana and inspired a wave of liberation movements across Africa, is often remembered as both a visionary and a tragic figure. His downfall in 1966 was the result of a complex web of economic, political, and international pressures. Yet if one were to pinpoint a single fatal mistake, it was his overconcentration of power and the creation of a one-party authoritarian state. This decision, intended to secure his Pan-African and developmental vision, ultimately alienated his people, weakened his legitimacy, and created the conditions for his overthrow. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, Nkrumah was celebrated as the redeemer of his people. His Convention People's Party, CPP, had mobilized workers, farmers, students, and urban poor through slogans like "Self-Government Now." His promise was to create a free, prosperous, and united Ghana that would serve as a model for the rest of Africa. But in pursuit of rapid modernization and continental unity, Nkrumah made the fateful choice to silence opposition rather than accommodate it. By the early 1960s, Ghana was facing economic challenges. Cocoa, the backbone of the economy, suffered falling world prices. Meanwhile, Nkrumah embarked on ambitious projects, building schools, hospitals, factories, roads, and the Akosombo Dam for hydroelectric power. While visionary, these projects required heavy borrowing and foreign aid. As debts mounted and living conditions for ordinary Ghanaians worsened, frustrations grew. Instead of opening dialogue, Nkrumah tightened his grip. In 1964, he declared Ghana a one-party state, enshrining the CPP as the sole legal political party. He argued that multi-party systems fostered division in newly independent African states, and that unity was essential for development and Pan-Africanism. While this may have reflected his idealism, it proved disastrous in practice. Dissenting voices were stifled, opposition politicians were imprisoned under the Preventive Detention Act, and the press was muzzled. Nkrumah also cultivated a personality cult with titles such as Osagiefo, the Redeemer, and propaganda that portrayed him as indispensable to the nation. This authoritarian turn was the fatal mistake. It broke the trust between Nkrumah and many of the very people who had once adored him. Ordinary Ghanaians facing economic hardships now had no democratic outlet to express discontent. Instead, resentment simmered beneath the surface. Intellectuals, students, and the urban middle class, who had been among his strongest supporters, turned critical of his government's excesses. Even workers and farmers, the backbone of the CPP, began to feel betrayed as poverty deepened. The military and police too became disillusioned. Nkrumah, suspicious of coups after surviving several assassination attempts, kept the security forces under tight control, often sidelining them while channeling resources into his political projects. Salaries stagnated, morale declined, and resentment spread within the barracks. By dismantling political opposition and alienating the army, Nkrumah inadvertently created a climate where conspiracies against him could flourish unchecked. International factors also played a role, but they compounded the consequences of Nkrumah's one-party rule. His increasingly radical foreign policy, supporting liberation movements across Africa, criticizing Western imperialism, and leaning towards socialist allies, earned him enemies abroad, particularly in Washington and London. Western intelligence agencies, wary of his growing ties to the Soviet bloc and China, quietly encouraged dissent. Yet foreign meddling alone would not have succeeded without the widespread domestic discontent created by his authoritarian rule. The breaking point came in February 1966. While Nkrumah was on a peace mission to Hanoi, Vietnam, the military and police seized the opportunity to stage a coup, codenamed Operation Cold Chop. Crowds cheered as statues of Nkrumah were toppled, and soldiers proclaimed an end to tyranny. The public's response revealed the depth of resentment toward his one-party dictatorship. Had Nkrumah retained the trust of his people and security forces, the coup might not have succeeded. Thus, while economic difficulties, Cold War geopolitics, and elite conspiracies all contributed, the central mistake was Nkrumah's decision to abandon pluralism and embrace authoritarianism. His belief that only a single party and a strong leader could unify Ghana blinded him to the dangers of concentrating power. By silencing criticism and dismantling democratic institutions, he cut himself off from the pulse of the people and allowed grievances to accumulate until they exploded. Ironically, Nkrumah's fatal mistake stemmed from the same determination that made him great. His single-minded pursuit of unity and rapid development inspired millions, but left little room for compromise or opposition. In the end, his dream of building a model African nation collapsed under the weight of authoritarian excess, proving that even the most visionary leaders cannot ignore the need for accountability and shared power. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and a leading figure in Africa's independence movement, spent the final years of his life in exile after being overthrown in a military coup on February 24, 1966. Following his removal, Nkrumah was offered asylum in Guinea by President Ahmed Sékou Touré, who made him honorary co-president. This period of exile marked a dramatic shift for a man who had once been the most powerful and celebrated leader in sub-Saharan Africa. Isolated from the political life he had shaped, Nkrumah devoted himself to writing, reflecting on African liberation and advocating for continental unity. His works, including Africa Must Unite, 1963, and Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, 1965, outlined his vision for a united Africa free from foreign exploitation, cementing his role as a theorist of Pan-Africanism. Nkrumah's health declined in the early 1970s. Living primarily in Conakry, Guinea, and traveling abroad for medical treatment, he was diagnosed with cancer. On April 27, 1972, he died in Bucharest, Romania, at the age of 62. Though far from Ghana, his death was mourned by many Africans who saw him as a symbol of liberation and dignity. His body was later returned to Ghana, and he was given a state funeral in Accra, attended by thousands who remembered him as the father of Ghana. Nkrumah's legacy is complex and enduring. Domestically, he is celebrated as the visionary leader who achieved Ghana's independence in 1957, making it the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. He invested heavily in infrastructure, education, and social programs, aiming to transform Ghana into a modern, industrialized state. However, his economic policies, ambitious industrialization projects, and over-reliance on cocoa exports sometimes led to financial strain. Moreover, his turn toward authoritarianism, including the declaration of a one-party state in 1964, and his suppression of dissent, alienated segments of the population and ultimately contributed to his downfall. On the international stage, Nkrumah is remembered as a Pan-Africanist who worked tirelessly for African unity. He played a central role in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963 and supported independence movements across the continent. His vision of a politically and economically united Africa continues to inspire leaders and movements striving for continental cooperation and development. In summary, Kwame Nkrumah died in exile, but his legacy endures as a pioneering statesman, a champion of African liberation, and a bold architect of Pan-African ideals. Despite his political mistakes, his life remains a testament to the struggle for freedom, dignity, and unity in Africa. Thanks for watching, and see you on our next video.